Hi, my name is Lucas Niebert, and I'm going to give you an update on the Dry Farm Corn project. This project was made possible by USDA Western SARE and also the Dry Farming Institute nonprofit. So just an overview, uh, most of this project is based on a grant I got from the Western SARE titled Establishing a Participatory Research Network for Drought-Tolerant Corn Production in the Pacific Northwest. And it's based on the fact that corn has not been historically adapted to the Pacific Northwest. And it's just varieties have been introduced here in more recent years. And with its relatively high latitude and cooler nights, there's only a subset of corn varieties are able to grow in the Pacific Northwest. And there's very particular growing conditions, including very hot summers and then into the rainy season in September when your corn needs to be drying down, but if it's not mature enough, then you're in trouble. So with that, I set out to do dry farm corn variety trials, and also I'll be giving you updates on dry farm corn breeding projects. Here's an introduction to the varieties I'll be talking about today. If you attended last year's conference, I talked a lot about open oak party mix dent corn breeding, and I'm going to be talking less about that today and more about the following two varieties. It's Oaxacan Green Dent Corn. This variety is relatively late maturing, as most dent corns are. However, it's still grown in the Pacific Northwest and could be adapted to be earlier maturing. And it is also prized by tortillerias. The other main variety I'm going to talk about today is Dakota Black popcorn. That is being grown actively in the Northwest. However, the popping rate can be improved and dry farming performance as well. So first, with the dry farm variety trials this past year, I engaged with 11 growers from Southern Oregon to Northern Washington, and mostly focused on the three varieties: Oaxacan Green Dent, Open Oak Party Mix Dent, and Dakota Black popcorn. And the growers were encouraged to grow any one or three of those varieties. And mostly we left it open to whatever plot sizes the growers wanted, as long as it was at a planting density of 2 square foot per plant. And so the sites ranged from 100 square foot to a half acre. Some participants did their own experiments. So 3 of them used no-till or strip tillage. Some of them made comparisons, and others just used no tillage. And then also a couple compared dry farm versus irrigated yields. And then soil moisture and yield data were collected by all participants, and it went pretty well. The key to this map is that the blue participants were able to send a full data set. The red ones had crop failures for reasons I'll get into in a little bit, and purple was not able to provide data. So here's a simple graphical summary of the variety trial, and because there's so much variation between sites on experimental design, I'm not going to pretend to do statistics on it, but I want to walk you through what we're looking at here for the summary. So we have each point is a plot, and on the y-axis we have yield per acre. On the x-axis we have days to harvest, and it's colored by the corn variety. And so these black ones are Dakota Black, green ones are Oaxacan Green, and then these orange ones are Open Oak Party Mix. And whenever there's a line between the two, that means they were actually grown on the same site, so you can make kind of a direct comparison. And also the no-till plots are in triangles. So that's just an overview of the diversity of what was grown. It's apparent that Dakota Black is earlier and slightly lower yielding than Oaxacan Green and Open Oak Party Mix, for example. And there were some relatively low yields this year. They were probably mostly due to soil structure, which I'll get into, and also a poor stand establishment in some cases. And the crop failures were in all cases due to trying this out for the first time All of them were dry farming for the first time, and all of them were dry farming on a new site. And just to compare this year's results, 2021 to 2020, where we did a much more diverse variety trial, just to give you a sense of how it compares with the yield per acre. We see that, the Dakota Black yielded very similar, in some cases very similar to last year, and there were some lower yields. Oaxacan Green yielded slightly higher in some cases than the previous year. And the open up party mix also yielded fairly well, especially on one site. This is actually the site where open oak party mix was grown, and here we did a till versus no-till comparison. This was the first year under no tillage, so the plants were smaller and yielded slightly less. And it's expected that under multiple years, then the effects of no-till will actually improve the yields. And then this is also a picture of just to get a sense of the diversity of sites. Campo Collective around in the Hillsborough area intercropped some dry beans, some Whipple dry beans in this case, with their Oaxacan Green dent corn, and they also used no-till system. So one thing that participants were asked to measure was soil moisture across all the sites, and this was using aerometer or watermark sensors, which measure moisture tension or water tension in the soil, and that's in centibars or kilopascals. Essentially, the water tension is the force required to remove the water from the soil particles, and so the higher it is, the less moisture you have in the soil. So you can see at 1 foot depth throughout the season, these are multiple sites. You can see as the top foot dries out, the water tension goes up, and then it plateaus out at maximum. I want to note here that water tension is also affected by your texture of your soil. So if you have more sand, for example, then you have just inherently a lower water tension. So you can't really compare them with each other directly very well, the different sites to each other in terms of how much water is actually available to the plant. And I just want to note here that this site was just bare soil, so crop failure. So another aspect of this is the moisture sensors are put right at the plant's roots, and when the plant roots access that water, then the soil dries out, and that water was still available on this site throughout the whole season because it wasn't accessed by plants. So after data analysis, it seemed like sand and clay content seemed to have the most influence on the dry farm yield across all the sites. And we had this soil data just for these two varieties, Dakota Black and Oaxacan Green, for those sites. And yeah, you can certainly see that having more clay in your soil and less sand will increase your yield in dry farming. Also, as I said, 3 sites did dry farm versus irrigated yield, and they had variable results. In one site, we saw, approximately 85% yield dry farm versus irrigated. So the dry farm yield was 85% of irrigated. And then the other 2 sites, it was down around 25, 50 for Dakota Black popcorn. And in 2021, when we did variety trials, the average was right around 66 for a bunch of different varieties. So you can really see a range of dry farming performance versus irrigated depending on what site you're working on. I wanted to also mention a couple sites grew Strubbe green next to Oaxacan green, and they are essentially identical. Strubbe green came from Minnesota, and it's part of a whole set of different colored dent corns from Ernest Strubbe, and it's thought that perhaps Oaxacan green did not come from Oaxaca, but actually came from Ernest Strubbe in Minnesota. To support that is the fact that Oaxacan green behaves a lot like a Midwestern dent corn and not very much like a Oaxacan corn. Strubbe green also has a bunch of off types, and they kind of represent the other colors that were bred by Ernest Strubbe. And Strubbe green seems to have a significant potential for an earlier green dent corn in the Pacific Northwest. It's 11 days earlier, which is kind of a lot when we're talking about corn being able to mature in time before the rains. And this is and the Oaxacan Green is kind of on the late side. And in addition, this year in both sites where it was tested, it yielded nearly as much as Oaxacan Green. So that kind of sums up the variety trial part of it. And now I'm going to just go over where we are at with dry farm corn breeding. And so if you went to last year's Dry Farming Collaborative meeting, we talked about how we were breeding the open oak party mix dent corn under dry farming conditions. And we were using this process of recurrent selection. It starts with, in the first year, you produce new breeding families, and then year 2, you evaluate them in the fields. And then the following year, you go back to your remnant seed and plant only the top 20% of breeding families, and you create a new open pollinated population, and you can produce breeding families at the same time. So with the open oak party mix, we're at year 3, where actually this year we created a new OP population, which we have yet to evaluate against the parent population. That's forthcoming this year. And then we also produced new breeding families to do this again next year. And I'm going to round out the talk mostly talking about Oaxacan Green, Dent, and Dakota Black popcorn, which we planted out in the field this year to plan out the breeding families. So Oaxacan Green Dent corn, we trialed 108 families and 3 reps across 2 sites. 2 sites, 3 reps each near Corvallis. We're breeding to increase the dry farming performance, but all other selection criteria we're using is earlier maturing, reduced lodging, and decrease off-colored kernels, particularly yellows. And then Dakota Black popcorn, we had 130 families we tried, and those were just 2 reps per 2 sites. And in addition to increasing dry farming performance, we wanted to increase the popping rate, select for a larger ear size, and also potentially release a spiky kernel line or a smooth kernel line. You can see there's some with these characteristic spiky kernels. Just some pictures of the season. This is Oaxacan Green Corn breeding families at Soul Cycle Farm. And you can see some of them are very distinct in terms of their maturation timing. And I'll tell you why in a second here. You can see notable differences just of the plants in the fields, looking at one breeding family to another. And then here's just a picture of, on one site we grew them together, next to each other rather, Oaxacan Green and Dakota Black popcorn next to each other. Also, here's some more pictures indicating differences, selecting for earliness. On the popcorn on the left, you can see this line still has a bunch of green leaves, and this one's more dried down. The same here for the Oaxacan Green. These taller plants are greener than the shorter plants, and taking longer to mature. And here is a distribution of how the breeding families looked with regards to yield per plot on the y-axis and days to maturity on the x-axis. And you can see, Dakota Black is generally earlier and lower yielding than Oaxacan Green. And, we're going to be selecting the top 20% of these breeding lines. So you can imagine the yield per plot the following year could be a lot better for both cases. For Oaxacan Green, we're definitely going to select for these earlier ones as well as the higher yielding ones. One thing to note is these 5 breeding families here were actually descended from a cross they made with Roy Callis flint corn to bring it earlier. So some of them are a little flinty, they're F2, but some of them have dented kernels, and that's going to help bring the population a little earlier, I think. We might even think about adding in some Strubbe green. Another thing, like I mentioned, we were going to try to reduce the amount of lodging we observed in Oaxacan Green, especially the larger plants. They get top heavy and they're late finishing. So a little bit of a rainstorm and a lot of them fall over. So we're really going to try to select for the ones that don't lodge as much. Finally, with the Oaxacan Green, we're working closely with Three Sisters Nixtamal to market it. And so there's going to be a special limited release of Oaxacan Green dent tortillas with Three Sisters Nixtamal. And in general, this tortilleria in Portland aims to source corn from us more locally. So we're going to try to do some more breeding specifically for that. And with regards to Open Up Party Mix, we grew out seeds this year of the improved population, and pending evaluations this year, we're going to try to release it as a new variety, a dry farm adapted variety of Open Up Party Mix. And that's going to be in collaboration with the Dry Farming Institute. I just want to say thank you to USDA Western SARE for the funding for this, and also all the folks who helped me in the field this last year, especially with harvest throughout the rainstorms, September and October and November. Yeah, also Amy Garrett for supporting me through these years, and the Dry Farming Institute. I would be happy to answer any questions.